explanation of the principles that distinguish tacit consent, implicit consent, agreement, promise, declared contractual obligation, oath, vow, and covenant. These mechanisms of commitment often get blurred together, but each rests on a different moral principle and carries a different moral cost of exit. Once the underlying principles are separated, the hierarchy becomes intuitive. Tacit consent is grounded in the principle of non-objection. It applies when someone could have objected but did not, and their silence is taken as acceptance. Because it relies on inference rather than expression, it carries very little moral weight. For example, if a neighbor leaves extra vegetables on your porch every week, and you never object, your silence may be interpreted as consent to the arrangement. But because silence is ambiguous, the moral obligation is weak and easily dissolved. Implicit consent rests on the principle of normative participation. By engaging in a practice, a person is understood to accept the norms that govern it. The classic example is driving. By choosing to drive on public roads, you implicitly consent to traffic laws, even if you never explicitly agreed to them. This form of consent is stronger than tacit consent because actions reveal intentions more reliably than silence, though they still fall short of explicit affirmation. Agreement marks the first genuinely robust form of consent. Its principle is voluntary assent. The agent expresses yes, whether verbally or behaviorally. This is the level at which the will is clearly and deliberately expressed. For example, if two roommates explicitly agreed to split chores on a weekly schedule, each has made a clear commitment. Because the choice is expressed rather than inferred, the moral weight is significantly stronger. A promise is a personal moral commitment grounded in the principle of voluntary assurance. Unlike a contract, which creates structured and enforceable obligations, a promise binds only through one's word and the trust in other places in it. Its force comes from the expectation that a person will act as they said they would, not because anyone relies on institutional mechanisms, but because reliability is part of moral character. For example, if you tell a friend, "I promise I'll help you move on Saturday," you create a genuine moral obligation even though nothing formal has been signed and no penalties exist beyond disappointing them. A promise is therefore stronger than a mere agreement, because it invokes trust and personal accountability, but weaker than a contract, oath, or vow, because it does not generate structured duties, public stakes, or identity-level commitments. The principle of a promise is the principle of voluntary assurance. Declared contractual agreement introduces the principle of reliance and obligation. A contract is more than an agreement. It creates expectations, generates reliance, and establishes enforceable duties. For instance, signing a lease commits both tenant and landlord to specific obligations, rent payments, maintenance, notice periods. Breaking a contract disrupts others' plans and harms their legitimate expectations. At this level, moral weight becomes institutional, rather than merely interpersonal. An oath represents a further intensification of commitment. Its principle is self-binding integrity. An oath is a public, identity-laden act that invokes honor, reputation, and sometimes sacred or existential stakes. A familiar example is a physician taking the Hippocratic-style oath, publicly committing to uphold standards of care. Violating such an oath is not merely a failure of duty, but a failure of character, because the oath binds the agent's integrity. A vow goes deeper still. Its principle is existential commitment. A vow binds the agent not only in action, but in life orientation. Marriage vows, monastic vows, or vows of abstinence all exemplify this category. For example, a monk taking a vow of poverty is not merely promising a behavior but adopting a life-defining orientation, whereas an oath binds one's honor. A vow binds one's inner will and chosen identity. Breaking a vow is a rupture in one's sense of purpose. At the top of the hierarchy stands the covenant. A covenant is the strongest form of commitment because it creates an identity-forming relationship that binds individuals into a shared story. The Jewish covenant is the clearest historical example of this. It is not merely a promise between God and a group of people, but the foundational act that creates the people themselves. The underlying principle here is the principle of identity-forming relationship. In the Jewish case, the covenant with Abraham, and later the Sinai covenant with the whole community, establishes a new collective identity, Israel, a designated place, the land, and a set of obligations, Torah. The covenant does not arise from an already existing religion. Rather, the religion arises from the covenant. Judaism is, in a deep sense, the ongoing life of that covenantal relationship. This is why the covenant is not simple. It is not a voluntary club membership or a personal vow. It is a binding that creates a people out of disparate individuals. For example, at Sinai, the people collectively affirm, "We will do, and we will hear," accepting obligations that define them as a nation. The covenant becomes the criterion for belonging. One is part of the people because one stands within the covenantal relationship, and one is outside the people by standing outside that relationship. The boundary is relational, not merely doctrinal or ethnic. The Jewish covenant also illustrates how a covenant binds across generations. It is not limited to the individuals who originally assent. It extends to their descendants, shaping identity long after the original moment. This is why breaking a covenant is not simply a breach of duty, but a rupture of relationship, one that affects the entire community and its shared story. The covenant is the architecture of the people's existence, not an optional layer on top of it. In this sense, the Jewish covenant is the clearest example of covenantal power. It creates a people, establishes a place, generates a law, and gives rise to a religion that persists by maintaining the covenant. The moral weight is maximal because the covenant binds not just actions or identity, but membership in a shared, enduring narrative. Taken together, these mechanisms of commitment form a progression from the weakest to the strongest forms of moral commitment. Tacit consent involves inferred will. Implicit consent involves pattern behavior. Agreement expresses the will directly. Promises bind the speaker's word. Declared contracts create structured reliance. Oaths bind the self. Vows bind the life. And covenants bind a community. Each step increases the moral cost of exit, from negligible blame at the level of tacit consent to profound relational rupture at the level of covenant. This framework also clarifies where a constitution fits. A constitution is not merely a contract, nor merely an oath, nor merely a covenant. It is a layered hybrid that draws authority from multiple commitment types at once. It functions contractually by structuring powers and obligations. It is upheld through oaths sworn by officials, and it operates covenantally by forming a political people and establishing a shared identity. Its endurance and moral gravity come from this covenantal core, reinforced by contractual mechanisms and oath-based commitments. In this sense, a constitution is best understood as a covenant with contractual machinery. The contract provides enforceability, the oath provides moral seriousness, and the covenant provides legitimacy, identity, and continuity across generations. This layered structure explains why constitutions feel morally weighty, why they bind people who never personally agreed to them, and why breaking them is treated as a betrayal rather than a mere procedural violation.